If you vote for me, all of your wildest dreams will come true.
Welcome, my friends, to the VFX for Motion podcast. You'll see it when you believe it.
A picture's worth 1,000 words, right? So it's really, this real-time tech is really turning into sort of a very effective translation layer between the creative brain people and the technical brain people.
Today's podcast is a really fun one featuring one of the more remarkable individuals I've ever actually known in the visual effects business. He's a really busy guy, and it's a privilege that he found time to chat with us. Kevin Bailey currently works directly with director Robert Zemeckis, among other work, but that one is a relationship that began with their work together in animated CG, as he'll tell us about. And it continued into a series of live-action feature films that went to a company that Kevin founded called Atomic Fiction. And this company was acquired in 2018 by Deluxe and is now part of Method Studios. Now, I know Kevin from way before that. I actually met him when he was a teenager, believe it or not. Rather than have to give a spoiler alert, I'm gonna let the first part of our conversation draw out how that ever even came about and what that tells us about his story. Enjoy. So Kevin, for those who don't know you, you have one of the more remarkable visual effects career stories that I know of. So what's your brief overview, as brief as you want to make it, of your career at this point?
Oh, wow. Yeah. It's definitely a non-traditional path. I'll say that. I mean, I got started as, actually not too differently from a lot of people sort of in our generation when I saw Jurassic Park, and I think I was 13 years old in high school and was just absolutely blown away. I'd obsessed over the book before the movie came out, and then the movie came out and just blew my mind all over again. I probably watched that film, 13, 14 times in the theaters while it was in the theaters. I just got obsessed, and I kind of loved movies when I was a kid, the Star Wars and Back to the Future, E.T. And I didn't really realize until I saw Jurassic Park that like the theme that kind of bound all the movies that I loved together was this sort of that they were these fantastical films that they were painting a picture of a reality that didn't exist, mostly using visual effects and special effects. And Jurassic Park really solidified that love of the sort of visual trickery using technology in my head. And so I decided I need to learn how to make dinosaurs. So my buddy Ryan and I, who were friends in high school and had known each other, and we'd known each other since we were about 7 years old, we went to, we had a computer-aided drafting class in this public high school in Seattle that we were going to. And we asked the teacher, he said, hey, can you help us learn to make dinosaurs using AutoCAD? and he was like, you idiots, you can't make dinosaurs with AutoCAD. But Autodesk has given me a couple of copies of 3D Studio Release 2 for DOS. Here's the manuals. Go knock yourselves out if you want to teach yourselves.
Wow.
So we started.
That didn't discourage you.
No, it totally didn't. And we started staying after school and teaching ourselves 3D Studio until they were turning the alarms on and the teacher had to go. And our teacher, like he stayed to make sure that we had the time we needed to teach ourselves. He let us take computers home during spring break and summer vacation. He was just like so amazing and accommodating with us. And we started using the equipment to make entertaining videos for the school student body, right? For assemblies and in classrooms. And that really helped us get an internship, that helped us get a job, we actually ended up working with Microsoft in our junior year in high school. It was super, super cool.
So I have a couple questions.
Sure.
And your path so far reminds me a little bit of Bill Gates, where he had access to some computer firepower as a kid.
Yeah.
What were you showing at the school assembly?
Well, we were kind of doing our sort of annual piece that we would create was a piece for the homecoming assembly, where we would generally do something sports themed. And, homecoming's always all about sports and usually has to do with some competition amongst the freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior classes. So we always themed it kind of around that. And we'd done it a couple of years before we got this Microsoft gig. And it was really, really kind of neat because it was a sort of a creative outlet for us. But we also started to realize that, like, hey, we can actually entertain people with this stuff, but just as a hobby, right? But it was
totally.
Yeah, it was really neat. And then when we were at Microsoft, we were featured in a documentary that was all about schools and industry working together. It was narrated by Robin Williams and had an Academy Award-winning director. And it just so happened to be funded by the George Lucas Educational Foundation, George's nonprofit. So GLEF, exactly. And George apparently saw us in the editing room of this documentary and had his producer at the time, Rick McCallum, give us a ring. And he said something to the effect of like, hey, my name's Rick. I'm working on this little movie you may have heard of called Star Wars. We're wondering if you guys wanted to come and visit us at Skywalker Ranch and hang out.
And you said, hell no.
Yeah,
we
exactly.
don't have time for that.
Exactly. I don't think I could have said yes any quicker. So yeah, right between our junior and senior year in high school, we went down and we stayed on Skywalker Ranch and babysat George Lucas's kids for like half a day and got chased by turkeys. And
wow. You know, George, I mean, that's how the dude who played Jar Jar Binks got in there too. Like he was at a company. I was at this company performance of Stomp. And George like saw this guy in the cast. He's like, I like that guy's moxie. I'm gonna have him beat Jar Jar Binks.
That's awesome. I actually did not know that story.
Well, then he had to wear a duck around on his head. You know, he was the guy with the duck on his head. Okay, anyway,
yeah,
we're going down a rat hole here.
Yeah, I tried to stay far away from Jar Jar during my tenure at Lucasfilm.
Wow.
But you know, in addition to the insanity of visiting the ranch, we got a kind of an e-ticket tour of the Star Wars art department, and this was before Star Wars Episode 1 was nobody really knew what it was going to be about or really anything about it. It was so super top secretive, and so we were two of the first 12, 13 people that had ever set foot in the Star Wars art department.
And you are still teenagers.
We're still teenagers. We were 17 years old.
Very much teenagers. Time. Wow. And so this was summer. This was like a summer thing.
This was a summer
junior
thing.
And senior year. Wow.
Yep.
Okay.
Exactly. And so we met Doug Chang and who's the production designer, and David Dezoritz, who was running the pre-visualization team, and we saw some early previs of the pod race sequence in Star Wars Episode 1. And on top of that, we got to go visit Industrial Light and Magic, got a similar tour, Dennis Murin and, Rob Coleman and a bunch of people were taking us around, and we're totally starstruck, right?
Dennis Murin, the guy who had won like 8 or 9 Academy Awards at that point.
And the people were, a lot of our friends were watching, Friends on TV or whatever, and we were watching Movie Magic, right? So these were our celebrities. So we left the Skywalker Ranch. They didn't give us a job offer because we had a full year of school left. But certainly we were inspired and said, we need to work at this place. So we devised our homecoming video for our senior year. We devised a project that was really aimed at convincing them that they would be stupid to not give us a job on Star Wars.
Yeah, good strategy.
And and so the video that we created, it was the first time we'd ever integrated CG in live action, and it was very closely patterned after the pod race sequence that we'd seen a sneak peek of, but not so closely that we would get sued. And had these 4 hovercraft flying through the schools behind, or flying through the forest behind our school, and also the halls of our school. And each hovercraft was one of the classes in our school, right? So it was the freshmen and the sophomores and juniors and seniors all kind of duking it out in these hovercraft.
Yeah. This time there can be only one.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, and it was one of those things. It was we had no idea what we were doing. We were completely winging it through the whole thing. We didn't know what rotoscoping was. We didn't know how to match move. We got a loan of a Sony DVX 1000 camera, which was one of the first DV cameras on the market. It was just, so there's a lot of kindness around us in terms of like giving us access to equipment, and then we just kind of had to figure out how to make it all work. And as we were doing that, we sent a video and a letter to Lucasfilm every month saying, here's our progress, give us a job. Here's our progress, give us a job. Until we were done with it, right? And when we were done with it, it was a raging success amongst the student body. And I remember actually, there was big cheers and all that, and everybody was rooting for their class. And it was, it totally had the intended effect in person in this giant auditorium. But the unexpected part was when we got back to where our sort of technology lab, our drafting class was, we saw a group of like 10 people crowded around a monitor watching it again. And that was when it really hit home. It's like, oh shit, like we're entertaining people. This is an amazing feeling. I love this, right?
It was like the 90s version of viral.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was, the viral VHS. Yeah, so we sent that to Lucasfilm, and a couple weeks before we graduated from high school, we got a call from Rick McCallum, George's producer, saying, and I'll quote, he said, "Quit sending us videotapes, quit sending us letters, you got the fucking job." And then we started 2 days after graduating high school. We moved down to California and started working on the ranch.
So had you thought up to that point about, I'm sure you were thinking about more the normal path, like college. Had you planned that out?
Totally, yeah. My father had been a college professor for a long time at the University of Washington, so there was sort of that expectation, and I think he has like 3 or 4 degrees, right? So there was definitely that expectation, and I'd actually gotten into Stanford. I thought I was going to go and become a lawyer because I honestly like this computer graphics thing. It always felt to me like a great hobby, and it really honestly wasn't until my butt was in the seat at Lucasfilm, and I actually got my first turnover on a shot from Star Wars to pre-visit that I actually realized. I really distinctly remember that moment of like, oh my God, this is a job. Even though I'd been working at Microsoft before and I'd been making money doing it, I just never put 2 and 2 together that this could be a career up until that very moment.
I mean, so many of us have a moment like that, but in your case, you had to keep your head from exploding, basically.
Yeah, no, it was just nuts. And working, we were literally on the 3rd floor of the main house at Skywalker Ranch, and could see, cows migrating around the hills, and George's office was right below us, and it was just
right. And he had that funny little elevator, his secret elevator that he ride up to.
Exactly. You had to have a special key to get up and down.
And that was, to put a little more context around that, previs was kind of an exotic thing. I mean, first of all, when you say you were winging it in the 90s, I mean, really, even at ILM, there was a lot of winging it going on in the 90s, let's face it. But also previs, which really, the purpose of which is to get the edit together before the visual effects, which often aren't, some of which won't be done until, maybe days before the film has to be printed, since we were talking about printed film in those days. Previs was, describe a little bit what you ran into in previs and how, it really actually sounds like you had a better background than most people in visual effects to do that work. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, in a weird way. It was because previs at that time, which I guess isn't dissimilar from how some movies still run it, but it was pretty new, and it was really a generalist task, right? I built most of my models and textured them and looked at them and did the animation and designed the camera and then comped all of it in After Effects. And it was like, now the tool set sounds laughable. It was After Effects and Electric Image and Form Z and a bunch of Photoshop thrown in. And so, but it was we kind of had to be able to do everything. And when the director or the editors sat down and said, hey, I ripped this footage from a World War II dogfight movie, and I think we want something like this, but just make it Star Wars. It was sort of like, you had to turn it around and do, 4, 5, 10 shots in a day. So it was really all about being scrappy and, trying to not let the tech and process get in the way of sort of being a little mini filmmaker, right?
Sure. Yeah. So you had a diverse set of skills, which you'd picked up just by messing around with stuff.
Yep.
And I think what I was referring to, honestly, and this segues to the next thing I want to talk about. So VFX, even at that time, was already a fairly assembly line kind of process. So generalists who could jump in, who could work in 3D, who could shade a model and do a certain amount of animation. I know you probably weren't getting pushed too hard on, say, character animation. And then, but comp the whole thing together. And, edit it, deal with timing, all the things you're talking about. Although I guess you were working on one shot at a time, but each shot was your own shot. Like there was nobody else to like, I mean, Ryan was there too, and you guys each had your own shots, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we did. Yeah, there was a team of, five of us that were kind of core, and it expanded a little bit towards the end. But it was, it was really, I mean, I think I counted at the end, and I think both Ryan and I each prevised about 800 shots for the film, and of which,
wow.
Probably a total of, 600 actually ended up in the final movie out of the 1,600 that we did. But that's kind of the point of previs, right? Is like try a bunch of stuff, and if it doesn't work out, it ends up on the cutting room floor. But it's quick, and you're not blowing a ton of money, especially when you have a couple of 18-year-olds working for peanuts, right?
Yeah, and before we segue into how that led you to the orphanage, I have one little question. It's kind of a funny story, but so you were working on the pod race. So John Knoll, that was his sequence, right?
Yep.
John Knoll, who now runs ILM. And
right.
I know there was a little thing that happened because I was on the other side of this to a certain extent where they were running the shots by George, and George kept saying it had to be faster. And the argument finally became like, that's not physically possible. And George, of course, was like, I'm a filmmaker. I don't care. I need them to go some surreal amount of time, speed. So that was a case where previs would have kind of established something like that, right? So, I mean, is that kind of how that played out? I mean, it was just kind of an interesting moment because, technically that's like everyone's just doing their job there. And yet the filmmaker always wins, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, the filmmaker definitely always wins because story's king, right? And everything that happens has to be in the service of the story, right? No, it's not like the universe is going to be offended if we break the rules of physics. But I think the key thing is and this is true even in visual effects, 20 years later today, is to always start with a sense of respect for what is physically possible and then extrapolate it from there, right? I think if an idea starts with no grounds in reality, then it's always going to look fake, and you're going to be constantly butting up against why it looks fake, that question mark. Whereas I think, what John's approach is, which I really love, is like, hey, start from what's real and then make the filmmaker make you deviate. But at least you're deviating from a foundation that makes some sort of sense. And that was actually a real, like a cool lesson that I learned through that Star Wars previs phase, because we started out just like doing whatever, right? Like we had no respect for the bounds of physical reality. And there were a few times where ILM, who had to execute on the, basically take this previs that we'd done and make it look real. I heard them come back to us and complain. It's like, why'd you guys sell us up a river here? You guys did something that like is totally undoable. And I started to learn from those guys and say, okay, well, we still need to do what George wants. But like, actually, if we start from something that's a bit more plausible and think for a second about that, it's going to make the shot look better. It's still going to get George what he wants, and it's going to make those ILM guys less pissed off at me.
Yeah, and I mean, looking at your work on, say, Welcome to Marlowe, I can see where you're still threading that needle very much, to this day. So then some guys from ILM went and founded the orphanage, and you and Ryan were among the first. Were you like employees number 4 and 5 or something?
We were number 1 and 2 because the founders
1 and 2,
count.
right? Because the three founder, right? Okay, so right, employees number 1 and 2, yeah. And at this point, you're probably not even pushing 20 yet, I'm thinking.
Yeah, I think we might have just turned 20, or we were on the verge of turning 20. Okay. And that group of guys, there was a group inside of ILM, as you know, called the Rebel Mac unit. So they used all the same tools that we were using on the previs side, and they were also sort of outside of this assembly line approach that, like you mentioned, had become already pretty prevalent in the way that, top tier visual effects worked, right? So the guys in the Rebel Mac team, they owned a shot from beginning to end, and they were kind of scrappy and worked outside of ILM's pipeline, but got stuff done and made it look great at a price point that I'm sure that the assembly line, had no hope in making, right? So those guys, they had this idea of like, hey, this is working really well within ILM. We're producing ILM quality work, right? Because we are ILM, but we're just doing it a lot more efficiently. Let's bounce out, start our own company, using that sort of ethos, and that's why Ryan and I kind of ended up saying, hey, this is a good fit for us. And they said, hey, a couple of young guys, who are on board with this way of working, they're a good fit for us too. So it was a great mutual fit. And the additional exciting thing about the Orphanage at the time was that their long-term goal was to actually create content, actually make movies that also kind of put their hooks into us.
So the founders were starting to make movies, but then there was also work for hire. And, in the beginning, I think the vision was like you complete a shot just like you were used to doing. But truthfully, there aren't that many artists capable of doing that. And it's a difficult thing to scale. Is that kind of how it played out?
Yeah. I think that there's sort of this idealistic notion that one artist, one shot is a way to make ILM quality stuff at a lower price point. And the idea was to then use the profits from that to fund the films that we were going to make and also do the visual effects on our own films. And like you said, the reality is that as you scale up, it's just not possible to have everybody do their own shot from beginning to end. And also, the efficiencies as a result of that start diminishing, right? Because it's also really hard to supervise a bunch of people all doing their own shot from beginning to end and keep quality consistent, right? So even if everybody was talented enough, it still creates a consistency issue from the supervision perspective. Whereas if you flip to a more assembly line and departmentalized model, then it actually becomes easier to keep consistent quality, and you need a smaller breadth of expertise with every artist that's part of that assembly line.
Yeah, well, very well summarized. And so it turned out that the skill set that you had didn't limit you. I mean, you didn't now have to go find another job somewhere where they just let you work on your own shots, although I'm sure you could have decided to do that. But instead, you've now got experience in a bunch of different areas. So you're well suited as the studio's starting to grow and actually take on real effects jobs that do need that assembly line of 80 or 100 people. You start being able to actually supervise.
Yeah, exactly. And it was actually something that I never really wanted to do. I'd always kind of, my goal from the beginning was like, hey, I want to help tell stories with technology, and to me the best way to do that was always on the box and making the pixels. Mm-hmm. And I remember even back in the Star Wars days, after we were done with previs, we got a chance to jump in and do some lightsabers and C-3PO shots for the final film, and I just got such a kick out of touching the final pixel that was actually in the movie. And so the Orphanage was a great way for me to do more of that. And then I just kind of ended up, I think because of that breadth of experience, we were doing this movie called Jeepers Creepers 2, which, isn't the most glamorous film in the world, but it was the first one that the Orphanage had done a lot of character work on. And it was also the first one that the Orphanage had done every shot in the film for beginning to end. And I just started kind of, we had to implement a bit of an assembly line workflow. And I just started to try to jump in and help out wherever I could. If people were struggling in an area and I saw it, I would jump in and help. And I don't think that I knew that I was going to get a CG supervisor credit on that film until I saw the credits of the film. And the founders had kind of realized that it's like, hey, he wasn't hired to do this job. I was, a senior artist or something on it. And granted, I was like 23 years old, but, they'd recognized that I'd actually done the job of a CG soup and give me the position. And so there you go. Now I'm Battlefield promoted CG supervisor. So
my memory, and the reason you were first to mind when we came to this topic for a podcast, was, that you became kind of there were quite a few go-to guys in the Orphanage. It's a very talented set of people who coalesced around that place. But you were certainly a go-to guy. And it was a really interesting time for visual effects, that decade of the noughts or whatever we call it, where the tools were getting pretty good, some things that had just been flat out missing, like camera tracking in the 90s, were now a thing you could rely on. And so it kind of took effects to another level of truly letting filmmakers, make Lord of the Rings or what have you. But at the same time, it was still a time when, each shot was kind of new. Like, and there were things would come up and it's like, wow, we really nobody's really done that well. And one of the ones I really remember, and this is a shot people may actually remember, in Day After Tomorrow, the guy getting out of the helicopter and he's got to freeze right in front of us. And I remember that shot went to you and it was like, whoa, okay, so this is going to be a close-up of a human on the screen, and he's got to lose his life in this kind of surreal way, but yet, it definitely cannot look like computer animation in the middle of this live-action film.
Yeah, that shot was nutty, and I actually have the weirdest credit ever on that movie. I think my credit on that movie is shot supervisor, because I just finished Hellboy and had come off of working a 134-hour week followed by a 128-hour week on Hellboy. And then they said, hey, we need help on this Day After Tomorrow thing. Can you come in and do this shot that we can't figure out how to do? And I ended up teaming up with Dagan Potter, who was at the time, he was kind of focusing on doing effects. And so he did all the frost, and then I figured out how to actually make the whole thing happen. And we did reprojections in Maya, and just, it was like per frame reprojections and then reanimating it, and kind of like almost old school, before optical flow was really a thing, kind of taking that approach to it. So it was really fun, and the kind of thing that I really got a kick out of.
Optical flow, just for people who aren't familiar, what would that approach now look like?
Yeah, right now, what that approach would look like is you would say, hey, here's this footage of this guy coming out of this helicopter. We need it to slow down to a complete stop. And you would basically just say, at the beginning of the shot, it's going 100%. At the end of the shot, he's stopped. And, anywhere where there's frames missing in between as he's slowing down, right, there's going to be bigger and bigger gaps where you don't actually have footage to create that.
So in other words, you're talking just about the in-between frame part of it. Because I was also thinking about the fact that you had to take the life out of this.
Well, yeah, and then on top of that, we could draw masks and everything that we were reprojecting. So we would draw masks in UV space of where does this guy get colder, or where does the frost start appearing first, and then I would give those animated masks in texture space to Dagan, and he would grow frost wherever it needed to happen, right? So it was one of those things where it was nobody that I talked to had ever done a shot like that. So we just kind of winged it and said, all right, well, what seems like it's going to work? Well, per frame reprojections and then reanimating and, this, that, and the other, that kind of seems like it might work. Let's give it a go. And then a bunch of stuff would break, and then we would figure out how to get around it. And eventually, a couple weeks later, we ended up with a shot that went in the movie. And you're like, oh, well, geez, I would have never have known that that's how we were going to do the shot when I started. But, it's just like everything in life and everything in my career, where it's all about keeping eyes open for opportunities that are feasible opportunities, but might be outside the norm.
That really, on the one hand, that to somebody working today would be like, what a huge pain in the ass that must have been. And at the same time, it's the fun, right? Like, you started out not knowing how the heck are we going to skin this cat, and you get to be inventive along the way.
Yeah.
And it sounds like that is still kind of in the job for you. Like that part of it is still there. Is that?
Yeah.
Right?
Every single day, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that, is I run into a thing where I'm like, I have no idea how I'm going to do this. And I just kind of wing it into the situation. And, we take educated guesses that get better and better as we get more experience. That said, I kind of feel like if I'm ever in a position where I know how to do everything that just popped up in front of me today, then I'm not really trying hard enough, right? Then I'm kind of in retirement mode. So hope to not be there for a while. And there's actually a great speech that Steve Jobs does. He did this Stanford commencement speech a number of years back, where he talks about his career and how Things like dropping out of school enabled him to take this calligraphy course for fun, and that ended up playing into having great typefaces on the Apple computer. And of course, having great typography on the Apple computers was what kind of sent it into sort of the mainstream publishing world, and then it grew from there, right? So without that weird set of coincidence, Apple would have never been what it is today. And he kind of makes the point, is like, I could have never connected those dots looking forward. It's only possible to connect the dots looking back. And I think every great shot in a film shares that same story. And certainly I can relate to that story in sort of the broader sense of my own career and every film that I work on.
I would love to talk some more about some other cases where you really had to puzzle out how to make a shot, because that's such a big part of what makes visual effects and all really art generation, motion graphics, what have you. They're all really interesting when you have a thing you want to do and you have to figure out how to do it. And then, adding a certain amount of pressure, like working on a Hollywood feature, obviously is another, aspect to it. But just like, I'll leave it open, like other cases where, like the shot we were just discussing, you had to approach something like, wow, I'm not totally sure how we're going to even do this.
Yeah, I mean, there are tons and tons and tons certainly from my earlier career, working on movies like, Hellboy or Superman Returns.
Yeah, like Hellboy, I remember Fire was, because I was working on Day After Tomorrow at the same time. I mean, Matt Hendershot showing these shots where Liz is lighting her thumb on fire. And I was like, well, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I haven't seen anybody do any good fire anymore.
Yeah.
And that was like, that's what I'm saying about that time, is like, that was a big deal.
It was a big deal. And
right?
the stuff that they had to go through to make that work. I mean, it was sort of the first iteration of Maya Fluids that they did that in. And they had to write tools that would actually go into the fluid caches and manipulate voxels sort of on the data, like on the actual cache file, in order to get the result that they wanted, right? And it was just nuts, and nothing worked out of the box, and it was just because it was all like Gen 1 stuff. And I remember, we even had to have dialogue with like Duncan at Autodesk, who was sort of the scientific genius behind the actual creation of these tools to make it work. And, there were things like motion blur was something that motion blur, especially when combined with ray trace reflections, was something that was really, really hard to do back in the day. So on Superman Returns, we were doing a shot where Superman is flying past the camera and about to put himself in the line of fire of this like Gatling gun, right? And Superman has a very glossy reflective suit on. And we could not for the life of us render him with motion blur. And so people were working on, doing like 2D vector blur on him to give him motion blur, but I hated 2D vector blur because it just looks like mushy crap, especially when stuff is flying close to camera. So thinking back to that Day After Tomorrow shot that I'd done of the freezing pilot, I was like, well, how about if we render him out without motion blur and then reproject him onto the geometry frame by frame. So you render him out and then reproject that render back onto the thing you just rendered, but turn off everything, right? So it's just a fully luminant reflection, and then render that with motion blur. And boom, it worked, right? So it was this sort of, and that's kind of what I was saying about, experience helps us to make better and better educated sort of decisions as we're winging it every day. It's like, if it hadn't been for that Day After Tomorrow shot, I would have never thought of doing a frame by frame reprojection onto CG geometry of a CG render that led to that shot looking really cool, right?
Not to mention that it's a case of not using the tools as designed. Like it's looking at what actually you could do with the tools if you don't just go with, the straightforward approach, which is still pretty valid.
Exactly. Right? Yeah. And I'll give you two more examples quickly of that exactly is, So the first movie we did for Robert Zemeckis as Atomic Fiction, I know we haven't gotten to me starting Atomic Fiction yet, but so there's a shot at the end of the movie, spoiler alert for those who haven't seen it, where you're in a courthouse with Denzel Washington's character, and he's basically just admitted that he was drunk and high as he was flying this airplane, which he barreled rolled upside down and ended up saving the whole, everybody on the plane. But, obviously it's not cool to be drunk and high, right? So he's just admitted this, and the camera pushes in to so close on him that you're just seeing his eyes, and then the camera moves around and then pulls back and reveals him still talking, but now he's in a prison environment, right? So it's a jump cut in time that's entirely seamless. You're just spending the whole thing in a close up on his eyes as this transition happens. And it's a really, really cool, powerful moment. And there was no way that we could figure out how to do this shot using traditional morphing techniques because we had two moving cameras that were orbiting around his head in two different lighting scenarios on 2 different days with him in 2 different positions. And we ended up, I had this idea of I'd just seen a demo of the Ocula tool set in Nuke that was really designed to deal with stereoscopic scenes, right? So you have left eye, right eye, and it would let you kind of create in-betweens of a left and a right eye, so you could adjust your interaxial, after the fact. And I was sitting there going well, that's kind of what we have here, right? We have 2 different cameras that are seeing kind of the same thing. What if we can use Ocula to sort of say, well, the A side of this shot is the left eye and the B side is the right eye, and use these stereoscopic tools to actually do this mono shot, but that's a blend. And that's kind of how we ended up doing the shot at the end of the day. So totally misusing the tool set, but for a purpose that was really successful. And then just one more sort of anecdote. This is really recent. This is on this movie that we did with Zemeckis called Welcome to Marwen. And in this movie, we're sort of in a miniature doll world where shallow depth of field is a really important part of selling the sort of authentic photographed, miniature photography look. Well, the problem with shallow depth of field is if you have characters that are sort of out of line with the focal plane of the camera, right? So if, you have a line of 6 people and one's far away and one's close, it's impossible to have all of them in focus and still get that really authentic look. So we actually said, well, geez, how would you have dealt with this back in the day? And our director of photography was like, oh, well, I would have used a tilt shift lens, right? It's like, oh, I thought tilt shift lenses were just for making landscapes look miniature, right? Yeah. And he's like, no, this is actually what it was originally designed for. So we were rendering using RenderMan, and it turns out RenderMan has tilt shift functionality in its lens shaders. So we were actually able to use tilt shift lenses to make these shots work digitally, right? And render all the defocus into it. And that actually then brought us to a shot where these dolls are sitting in a U shape around a bar. And Bob Zemeckis, he wanted all the girls' performances to be in focus, but he didn't want to rack focus from one girl to another as they delivered their lines. So I said, well, if this worked, I know another trick that, a traditional filmmaker might use is a diopter, right? Which is basically bifocals for a camera lens that let you have both deep and close things in focus in different parts of the shot. But because they were in a U shape, that wouldn't work, right? Because they both got closer and further away from us at different parts of the frame. Yeah. So what we ended up developing is, with Pixar's help, is actually a tool set that would allow us to effectively draw a curtain in a shot. And wherever that curtain is in depth is what's in focus. So we would basically have a custom, perfectly, infinitely variable diopter throughout this whole shot. So we could have the shallow depth of field of a miniature photography, but have everything that needed to be in focus in the shot perfectly in focus, and it worked brilliantly. And it's you can't tell when you're looking at the shot. You don't feel it as something that's weird because it's sort of an old school concept brought into the new school. But it's one of the few instances in the last 5 years that I've had of doing something that's like really truly unique from a methodology perspective for sort of a photographic creative purpose. So it was super fun.
I mean, it goes right back to what you're saying at the very beginning of this conversation about needing to obey the realities of, we could say, the physical world, also the optical world, and it's amazing, isn't it, that like you're describing this, and at one level you could listen to it and say, well, why did they need to be but why were there focal issues if you could just render them all clearly? It's like, well, obviously, even to someone who doesn't necessarily know their way around a camera, it just wouldn't look right. Yeah, I mean, at some level, we can sense, like, even if we don't do this for a living, whether it's looking right or not.
Yeah, I think that's spot on the money, and that's probably the most challenging part of the visual effects process. At the end of the day, is that your general audience member is not going to know anything about the technicalities of how we do what we do. What they are going to be extremely well attuned to is the things that they're used to seeing every day. Right. So that's why digital humans are so hard, is because it's not that the audience member is going to go like, oh, well, their third level subdermal map just really looks like it's got too much blue in it. They're just going to go like, that person looks scary. Right. And that sort of like gut level, the audience is always gut checking our work against their historical database of what they've seen for their entire previous life. And I think in that regard, like sometimes I'll just, on movies where I'm allowed to, I'll be having people over for dinner or whatever. I'll just be like, hey, can you come look at this shot? Let me know what you think. And I'll gut check our work against people who don't know. I trust their aesthetic sense, but they don't know anything about our industry, because sometimes we see too much of the technical, and it actually gets in our way of seeing what the actual problem was, which is actually one of the reasons why, and I know you're well familiar with this technique, but a lot of times a trick as we get closer to the end of the shot, right, of being completed, and we've been looking at it for weeks on end, we'll just flop the shot. And when you flop the shot, it's like it shocks your brain into going, this is something that I haven't seen before. Let me objectively evaluate it. And it's one of the most useful tools in reviewing visual effects work out of anything.
Yeah, and you can do it right on the spot as opposed to having to go get a cup of coffee.
Exactly.
And then look at it again.
Exactly.
All right. Actually, I was just thinking before I definitely want to get into atomic fiction, but one more orphanage thing I want to get into a little bit, because After Effects is so much of a focus for School of Motion in general and the course that I'm doing. Sin City had this custom look that had a recipe, and I was supposed to work on this show, but it happened that when I got the call, I was in Indonesia, so I had to say no. But you're credited as the look development supervisor on that. So I'm thinking you could tell me something about how that came about and what was in that, just broadly, like maybe what was in the recipe, but also how you go about, creating something like that in After Effects.
Yeah, I mean, Sin City was really, really interesting because we were trying to emulate this crazy contrasty, truly black and white Frank Miller graphic novel style. So every part of our process kind of had to be geared towards that. And we're lucky enough that one of the founders of the orphanage, Stu Maschowitz, is a total After Effects genius. And he still is to this day. And back in that day, he was doing things with After Effects that nobody thought were even possible. We did all of our compositing in After Effects up until probably 2005, 2006 for all the films that we worked on. So he was actually working on creating this recipe that was a sort of a look layer that would sit at the very end of a comp on top of everything. And in every pre-comp, we would have the ability to have this sort of look layer, in the comp, so we could actually, see what the end result might be. And so every shot actually had to, there was sort of this generic setup, and then there was the ability to tweak on top of that.
So it was like a really, really elaborate version of a LUT.
It was, yes, it was a really elaborate version of LUT. And the interesting thing is that a lot of people don't realize this, but all the work that we did up until the really, really elaborate version of the LUT was applied wasn't contrasty like that. It was actually like, so there's detail painted into the areas that were going to become completely black. And you ask yourself, like, why the hell would you waste your time painting detail into areas of matte paintings and things that are going to be completely black? Or as is in the case with like, a black car, like the look dev that we did on that car, most of it you don't ever see. But the interesting thing is that when you put this LUT on top and it throws all that information away, there's that transition zone between light and dark. And the detail that was there would break up that transition. So instead of a, fuzzy shadow line that looks CG, it would kind of have all this grit to it that just made it feel authentic and like it was a photograph that had been contrasted rather than some crappy CG thing that had been painted. So a lot of detail went into that movie to result in just a feeling rather than actually being a pixel that shows up on the screen.
Huh. That's a really interesting way to frame that.
It was a fun and kind of a mind bender of a show to work on. But, that was what I always loved about working with Stu as well is, and he's over with Red Giant now helping them make tools for people in the industry, predominantly using After Effects. And Stu, if there's anyone that I know out there that has that outside the box, let's take a tool and bend it to do something that nobody ever thought it could do, it's Stu. And so every show that he was on, I learned a lot from him in terms of kind of taking the perceived norms and just chucking them out the window because, who needs those anyway?
So I want to go in a couple different directions here and incorporate some of the questions I had for you. The Walk was just such an amazing movie, and so now we're moving forward to your atomic fiction experience, and you can talk us through a little bit how the career progressed. So the thing with The Walk, I'm specifically interested in how creating the sense of vertigo required compositing into an environment that, and I'm kind of drawing in how Previs played into this and anything else you kind of want to say on that side of it.
So as I continue to grow at the orphanage, and I got the chance to, be a visual effects supervisor on a Harry Potter movie when I was 25, 26 years old. And so lots of really, really great opportunities that put me far, far outside of my comfort zone. I started to realize that this sort of like one shot, one person approach that we were still trying to kind of do a lot of was ending up really killing me and killing everybody else that was working there. And it was really, it was a place that was wonderful and created amazing bonds. It was also too heavily on people and not heavily reliant enough on the technology to support the people. In my view, that was kind of my take on it. So I said, I want to go somewhere that's like more technology forward. I want to try to push myself in that context instead. So I went and started up with a company that Robert Zemeckis and Doug Chang had pulled together called Image Movers Digital, and it was Disney funded, and I was one of the first non-art department employees there. And I actually took a step down in terms of my title to go there. I was a DFX supervisor working under George Murphy, who was the visual effects supervisor, alongside of a couple of other really talented guys, Joel Frisch and Rodney Ueshina. And we grew that facility to like 700 people across, the Bay Area and LA. And it was the polar opposite of the orphanage, right? We had all the money in the world. We could invest in all this technology. We had an R&D group that was, 20, 30 some odd people.
Right. And the broad mission there was animated films.
Yeah, it was animated. The broad mission was animated films and mocap films. And the idea was that Zemeckis would do one film and then they would have a guest director come in and do one while Bob was getting the next one up and running, and then they would alternate. So the first film was A Christmas Carol, and then the second film was Mars Needs Moms, and for that film I was promoted to visual effects supervisor on that film. So, which was great, except for unfortunately about halfway through the post-production of that film, Disney said, well, yeah, we don't want to do this thing anymore. We're shutting you guys down after you're done with this film, right? So we had to actually finish the whole movie we're sort of like the band playing on the deck of the Titanic as it's going down, trying to keep everybody motivated and all that stuff. And it actually ended up being a great time. But, after having these two totally polar opposite experiences, the orphanage that was like really kind of culture focused, relying on the people, but under investing in technology, and Image Movers Digital that, was heavily investing in technology, but didn't have a lot of the sort of the cultural soul of what the orphanage did. It was sort of like, well, geez, how about if we can find a way to do both of these things, try to combine the best of everything that we've experienced using things like cloud computing instead of building a data center, and, having sort of a people first approach, but embracing sort of a more of a assembly line approach. And so we said, okay, cool. That all sounds promising on paper. Like, let's start a company. So we started Atomic Fiction about 9 years ago. And that just was one of the craziest, most difficult, most rewarding experiences of my life. And so many cool projects. And one of the ones that I'm particularly proud of was a movie called The Walk that was Robert Zemeckis' the second movie he'd done with us as Atomic Fiction. And this film is about this crazy French high-wire walker, Philippe Petit. He's still alive today. And back in the 1970s, he illegally strung a high wire between the Twin Towers and walked on it. So our, Bob's vision for this movie was, let's give the audience a thrill ride. Let's put him up there, put them up there on the wire with Philippe Petit and let them experience what it was like to actually be 1,400 feet off the ground without any safety gear, doing something that nobody had ever done before for the pure art of it, right? I think he really related to that story of like, just going to the ends of the earth for creativity, right? And that's what Philippe Petit did. To do that, we really had to be able to recreate this sense of vertigo and these feeling of heights that you would get up there.
Which cinema also, by the way, gives you the ability to deliver. Like when you can work on a big screen, you're creating an experience that it's not going to do maybe what VR does, but that's about the only further place you could go as far as getting people to buy off on, do they feel that sense of being in this crazy position that this guy was in.
Exactly. And it, Bob, he's only made a few 3D films before, and he was like, yeah, this one needs to be 3D. Like Flight wasn't 3D, and none of the films we've done with him after that have been 3D, but he was like, this one needs to be 3D because it actually serves the story. We filmed it in Montreal. We built a big set that was like kind of the corridor of the World Trade Center. And it was, we had a high wire up there, and we had a professional high wire walker, this guy, Jade Kinder Martin, who's the sweetest guy, who did a bunch of the stunt work. And we had to do face replacements on him to make him look like Joseph Gordon-Levitt. But he also taught Joseph Gordon-Levitt how to walk on a high wire. And so did Philippe Petit himself. So Joseph actually did a bunch of the high wire walking himself. But at the end of the day, that feeling of vertigo is going to come from, the shot design, right? So it's like every time you start looking at an edge and then the camera moves out over it, your stomach's going to drop. And so that, I think, was half of it. And then the other half of it was sort of the execution in post-production. And I was really lucky enough to be able to go up above New York City for 2 straight days in a helicopter, and we got special permission to hover over where the trade towers were. And we literally just went up there with a helicopter with a red camera in the nose of the chopper and filmed reference for what New York City, modern New York, looks like at 1,400 feet above where the World Trade Center towers were at different times of day. So that reference was really helpful in helping our team to recreate what 1974 should have looked like. And what was even more helpful for me as a visual effects supervisor on that film was remembering that feeling that I got every time we hovered into position and I was able to look down through this window that was in the footwell of the helicopter, and just this sense of utter terror and disbelief that overcame me about oh my God, this guy was actually here doing this thing without any safety gear. And I was able to kind of take that feeling back into shot production. And every time I review a shot, I'm sitting there saying, does this shot make me feel like that day in the helicopter? And if the answer was no, we knew that something was wrong. And sometimes it was the lighting, sometimes it was the lens that we were using, sometimes it was, a sense of atmosphere or being able to see a couple birds in the shot, whatever. But it was really kind of a puzzle to put together of like, how do we give that sense of vertigo? And really it all comes back to the same thing that we were talking about before. It's like, how does the audience feel when they see a thing? It doesn't matter if it's technically right. Are they feeling the right thing? And is that feeling that they're having in service of the story? So at the end of the day, when you were talking about film being one of those sort of mediums that we can encourage people to feel a certain thing by what they're seeing on the screen, short of VR, right, being sort of, one of the more immersive things. When this movie premiered, some of the more vertiginous moments, I don't know if that's a word, but like the moments that inspire the most vertigo, people in the audience were literally gasping and turning away from the screen, right? And so I actually think that like you wouldn't want to do that movie in VR because I think people would literally just die, right? But it was really cool to see this visceral physical reaction being inspired in the audience. And I still, to this day, I mean, we did that movie, I think it was 4 years ago. And still to this day, I have people come up to me and go like, you just scared the poop out of me when I was watching that film. And I've seen it 4 more times, and every time I can't help but avert my eyes in some scenes, right? So it's pretty satisfying.
So let's talk a little bit about tools for the job. I'm really curious if the 13, 14, 17, 18-year-old Kevin Bailey were in high school today with the same basic interests, what would that kid be playing around with now? And especially if you were going to catch the attention of the current Kevin Bailey who could hire him.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think After Effects is still obviously really relevant in the ability to sort of create cool looking stuff in a way that doesn't overwhelm you with technical barriers, right? So I think that's a great tool. On the opposite end of it, but it's still something that if I were in high school, I would probably be nerding out on right now is Houdini and Nuke. Like I'm a big node junkie, right? I love node based stuff.
Yeah.
And the stuff that is doable in Houdini these days, I think that it kind of far surpasses the ability to sort of do outside the box things. And you did a lot of talking about using a tool for something other than its intended purpose. I think with Houdini, that's almost sort of its intended purpose, right? Is to just be able to kind of just go as outside the box as your brain can take you. Those tools, and obviously, if you're looking to get a gig in the industry, Maya are really where it's at, and Nuke for compositing in the effects industry. Although, I would say that in a lot of ways, starting with After Effects before Nuke is probably a better way to get your head grasp around the sort of like the basic principles of compositing, again, without being really too bogged down in the technical of it.
Yeah, it's funny. I try to explain, and I hear you. Like, for example, on the 3D side, Nuke is far more sophisticated at this point. But it's expensive, so it would be hard for a kid to have a usable copy of it or really go get a job at a lot of places other than the high-end studios.
Yeah, that's true. And one thing that does warm my heart is a lot of these companies, I know Foundry and Autodesk and Side Effects, and they do support education well. So I think that,
yeah, as they should, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's it's only grooming the next generation of people who are begging to have another license of Nuke, right? And so there are definitely some of the schools out there that I'm seeing that they go for these educational licenses and they actually provide them to their students. For people that are going to schools that they don't have access to that kind of software, I would just encourage everybody to go and talk to their local resellers or talk to a company in the area that, may have expertise I've heard plenty of stories recently of a reseller going like, hey, I'm going to pull some strings within, company X, Y, or Z, and we're going to get you a license that you can use at home or at your school, or studios that have said, hey, you know what, we're kind of in between projects right now. We got a bunch of free workstations. If you sign up as an intern, we're not gonna use you as an intern, but it's this workstation over here is yours to do whatever you need to with. A lot of the bigger studios won't do stuff like that because of security reasons, but the smaller ones do. It's sort of a version of what I had to do when I was 13, 14 years old, which is like go ask everybody who I thought might have access until I found the one that did, and then we worked with a reseller in the area to give us access to additional stuff that we wouldn't have been able to get otherwise. So I think as long as you show that you're motivated and interested and you want to learn, I think that there's a equal reaction on the other side of like, oh man, this person wants to learn. Like I really want to help her or him.
Right, which is definitely part of your origin story.
Absolutely.
It's definitely the case. I mean, right now, I would say, a lot of people that I know who are using, say, After Effects and Cinema 4D are thinking about Nuke and in particular Houdini. And, there's a whole story to unravel, and I don't want to go too much down a rat hole here, but I am curious. I mean, it is kind of true that as much as Nuke dominates the high end, After Effects is really the most ubiquitous. Like it's the most widely used once you leave behind feature films. Yeah, I mean,
absolutely.
Like pretty much every other level of project. And so I don't know, I mean, so in other words, and with Houdini, I don't know as much about this part, but, I think that there's people doing pretty amazing things kind of in a mock procedural way that Houdini would do purely procedurally. And again, you can kind of show a lot and get pretty far and go there when you're ready.
Yep, exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
Totally.
Okay, cool. And I'm curious about like the newest of the new, like VR engines for prevising or even creating visual effects. Have you guys gotten into that at all? Unity and Unreal?
Yeah. I mean, right now we're using Unreal extensively on the film that we have in production right now, which is called The Witches. It's based on a Roald Dahl story. And, the story features these kids who get turned into mice by evil witches, and they spend the majority of the film running around a hotel trying to foil these witches from, turning the rest of the children of the world into mice. So,
cool.
Yeah, by the nature of that story, I mean, we got to do, fuzzy animals and digital environments and whatever. But, we shot this thing in London, and we had to decide really early on what of the mouse action that we would try to shoot live action footage for that we could then put digital mice into versus what was going to need to be all digital to begin with. And that kind of the approach of figuring that out ahead of time was inspired by, I saw this amazing SIGGRAPH talk by the people who did one of the Ant-Man movies. They spent 15 minutes talking about, how they designed these shots and periscope lenses and miniature explosions and this and the other. And then, at the end of that all, there was sort of another section where they talked about the digital stuff, and it was sort of this unspoken thing. But I saw that, hey, the thing that you did digitally is the same thing that you showed yourself shooting, which must mean that you threw the thing you shot out and did it digitally at the end of the day. So I'm sure it was great reference, but man, what a way to spend production time, right? So we kind of said, we don't want to do that. We want to shoot what we know we can use, and then we'll photograph tons of reference. So everybody always has reference to work with, but we're not going to burn days and days of a unit shooting just to throw it away.
Wow.
Yeah. So we ended up prevising almost all of the mouse action in the film using designs done by the art department. That we were sitting right next door to the art department. So the production designer would buy off on a design. We would get a 3D model of it. We would put that 3D model into Unreal, make it look as great as we could. And then Bob Zemeckis would go in there with a virtual camera and design the shots that he wanted, right? And it was a really cool experience because it was an integration of this on-site previs team that we had, the art department on a film that don't work together that often, that closely, and also Method Studios, who's doing the vast majority of the work on the film. That Method's animators were actually doing the animation for some of the harder stuff and building a bunch of the assets, and they actually built the rigs on these mice so that when our on-site previs animators would pick up animation or take a cycle or do some custom stuff, it was all based off stuff that really was born with the visual effects vendor, right? So we have, animation and builds that are coming in from the vendor using designs from the art department with the director lensing it as directly as he could. And that would tell us, it's like, oh, well, we can't shoot this shot because the mouse is it's inside of close focus on this lens. Like, we literally won't be able to focus the physical camera close enough. Or we're going to go through 3 walls in this shot and they can't, this is the way the set's designed, that's a load-bearing wall, we can't actually remove that. Okay, that shot has to be digital. But then there was a bunch of other stuff that we could shoot for real. And so by using Unreal as sort of the viewfinder into what our world was going to look like months before a physical set was ever built, actually enabled us to be extremely efficient when we were shooting on set. And also they kind of served as moving storyboards for everybody, from the lighting team through the props people and really everywhere in between. So it was a really, really useful tool. And now that we're in post-production, we're doing almost all of our post-viz through Unreal as well. So it's a really critical component of the workflow these days.
And how would you describe post-viz in this process?
Yeah, so post-viz in the film that we're doing right now, and The Witches, falls into a couple different categories. One is film the shot, and we need to put mice into that shot or do an environment extension, right? So that will basically do compositing in Unreal still, but we'll do compositing of a mouse onto a live action background plate. Then there's other stuff where it's like, hey, this is going to be a fully CG scene. We now know what our mouse actor performances were. We go and animate some mice, and then we actually do virtual camera layout. So we basically are shooting that scene. We're just doing it after we shot physical production. So lots of different variety. And then there's some stuff that it's like, hey, we have a long take that Bob actually wants to shorten. So he's removed 5 seconds out of the middle of it. Can we do a blend with an actor in frame? Can we do a blend that sort of bridges that gap that the audience won't be able to see, right? And a lot of that work we do in After Effects.
Wow, I have a bunch of questions. So coming off that one, and I'm going to try to, these are questions that could go deep, but let's just see if we can hit a few of these points. So I'm curious, what, if anything, what tools do you see like in the next decade just inevitably being out there, if any? Like,
of the sort of inevitable tools that will be out there, I think that Nuke is going to remain persistent. I think After Effects is going to remain persistent. I think that the Foundry, actually, of the companies that are out there, is probably one of the more inspiring ones in terms of what they're pushing forward. And their new CEO, Jody Madden, I've known her for years, and she's just she's been in touch with production for so long that I think that company has a real chance of taking what's already an incredibly useful tool set for production and just taking it to the next level under her guidance. So I think it's really exciting to see what they're pushing forward. And then there's the real-time side of things. I mean, Kim Libreri and the team at Unreal at Epic Games, I think they have a vision for where Unreal could take things in production that is a vision that not a lot of people can really grok at the moment. I'm not sure that I do, but I like Kim. You hear him talk about his experience on the Matrix movies, and you're sort of like, wow, how much did you do in how little time, and how crazy must people have thought you were, and you pulled it off anyway, right? And that's just sort of Kim, right? And I think that what I'm already seeing out of Unreal, it's completely plausible to see a future where you can make an entire movie in Unreal, or at least in a very integrated way with live action, where you're walking away from set every day with your final shots for 90% of stuff. I don't think we're actually that far away from that, and I think the next 10 years is gonna show us being in a position where different technologies are going to come together to create a set of tools that will enable that to happen. Machine learning based rotoscoping and depth map generation. So you won't have to have green screens or blue screens anymore. You take that and you combine it with a real-time engine and real-time camera tracking, and all of a sudden you're in a world where it's like, oh man, I can shoot somebody in the conference room and literally put them on a space station, and it's just it's gonna work, right? And that's pretty exciting.
So you said you still like to be in the trenches and you still like to make stuff. So is there a typical day, and does it include you getting into that level of work? And, tell me a little bit about maybe not a day in the life, but days over the course of a month in the life of Kevin Bailey.
Yeah, I mean, a day in the life of my world is it morphs, which is the great part about it. It makes time feel like it passes slower, right? It's like when we're shooting, there are 13, 14-hour days where you're filming and then planning the next day's stuff, and constantly running around a movie set. And on this film, I was able to do some second unit directing, which was really fun. And so a lot of variety there. And then, while we're in post-production, it's all the different various phases. And I actually try not to be on the box, because I want to make sure that nobody feels like I'm stepping on their toes, and I'm really helping to empower the people who are actually, it's their job to do this stuff. But when I do, actually right before this call, we've got a deadline coming up in a couple of days, and everybody's slammed, and I was like, all right, well, there's like the sign for a hotel entrance that needs to be designed, so I'm just going to do that. And I jump into Photoshop and, make it happen or whatever. So
right.
Normally when I do stuff on the box these days, it's usually because it's sort of a last resort. But I do love it. I love jumping into a comp at, as sick as it sounds, at 2 a.m. and fixing the haze level is just slightly too magenta because the director just freaked out about it, and it's like, all right, cool, I'll get this done. And that stuff is really fun for me. It's just I got to be careful not to do too much of these days.
Understood. Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking, so it's often the case, people who love the late nights and get deep into the technical side of it often don't, there's sometimes something lacking on the emotional intelligence side. And yet it strikes me that, like in your case, setting up a kind of a relationship with somebody like Bob Zemeckis, filmmakers they're not built the same way. And it's not so easy for technical people sometimes to develop a relationship like that. And so I'm kind of interested how that came about, and like it's a little unusual to be a filmmaker's sort of, any kind of go-to for that person. And it seems like that's been happening for you.
Yeah. And I think that it is, I really probably have my parents to credit for that, right? Where,
cool.
My dad was like, he's a scientist, and really analytical and smart. And my mother is, she's also very intelligent, just she's a people person, right? And I think that the combination of those two, and also like I had a bunch of really great sort of role models and examples growing up where I'm like, oh yeah, like that person, because he actually gives a shit about what somebody else thinks, actually got something better out of it at the end of the day. So, for me, I've always been really intently focused on the sort of like the people side of things, and the tech side is just something that like is sort of a means to an end, I guess. Like I've never really liked technology for the sake of technology. I've always liked it because it's helped me to tell a story or interact with somebody in a way that I wouldn't be able to otherwise. So maybe I just kind of like looked into that being an MO of mine, where I'm not really into technology for the same reason as maybe everybody else is. But at the same time, I've seen a lot of really tech focused people say, you know what, I want to be a filmmaker's go-to, and then figured out their own way of doing that, right? But it is sort of a human interaction, like understanding the creative side of what that person's trying to do. And this actually brings up one of the reasons why I love this real-time technology so much, is because in the old world of visual effects, where a director would say something and then the visual effects supervisor, who may or may not be super in tune with what the visual effects or what the director wants, they hear it, they go and execute, and it's a week later before the result is shown to the director. And then the director is either going to go, oh yeah, that's exactly it. Or they're going to go, that's nothing like what I wanted, right? But a week or even a few days, that's a long round trip. Whereas what real-time tech is doing right now is and we did this on Welcome to Marwyn and on The Witches, is what real-time's allowing us to do is it's allowing the director to say a thing, and then it might be a set design change or it might be a lighting change, right? We can do that in Unreal quickly and see the result right then and there, whereas otherwise it would have taken us, days or weeks to show that result. And I think that helps to build that translation layer between director and his crew, not only on the visual effects side, but also for all the other physical departments. And it also helps me because when I, as visual effects supervisor, say, hey, I need a bit of blue screen here, or hey, can we tweak this lighting just a little bit? It's not just me saying something like that I need something and everybody having to trust me. Like I can actually just go and show somebody. I was like, oh, well, this is why in real time, and a picture's worth 1,000 words, right? So it's really, this real-time tech is really turning into sort of a very effective translation layer between the creative brain people and the technical brain people.
All right, final question. And speaking of technology for technology's sake, you're really into cars. You were racing Miatas when we used to work together, and you've posted some fancy cars on Instagram. So what have you been driving lately?
I actually just picked up a Tesla Model 3, this is actually my fifth Tesla, believe it or not. When Atomic Fiction started to do well, I'd gone for almost 3 years without getting paid. And had drained all of my everything into the company. And when the company started to do well, I was like, I'm gonna treat myself. I'm gonna get a Tesla, and got one of the first Model S's that was delivered in 2013. And ever since then, I've kind of been rolling through them. So I just got the Model 3 Performance, which is just, I love it. But I've always been a gas guy, right, as well. So I've gone through my fair share of BMWs and Porsches and Ferraris and whatever. Then my wife always bags on me for spending way too much money on cars, but it's sort of my vice outside of work that helps distract me a bit. So yeah, I love it. I just love it.
Awesome. I don't think you haven't been on a track against other competitors much, probably.
I have recently I did a track day in a Porsche 911 GT3, which was just mind-blowing, and this December I'm going to do the 25-hour race at Thunder Hill, which is we're going to be a team of three people, and we're going to...
I've been out to that track. Oh yeah.
And a lot of the car commercials that you see are shot there. It's a beautiful location, green rolling hills.
Yeah.
Yep. And it's great because there's no walls to crash into. So, there's this crazy 25-hour endurance race, and we're going to, me and two of my buddies from London, we're going to team up together and trade turns, driving 25 hours straight with my buddy Jason Hoover manning the team. So he did all my Miata prep work when I was a young whippersnapper first starting to race. So it's great to be working together with him this far down the line. And now he works on Ferraris and Bentley teams and this, that, and the other, and he's just doing this for fun. So so it should be a good time.
All right. Well, thanks for chatting, Kevin. I loved this discussion. I really enjoyed it.
Cool. Yeah, it's always great to chat with you, Mark. And when we're in the same city at some point, we should get together for a beer. It would be great to catch up.
Excellent. All right. I gotta say, whenever I see artist presentations at conferences, I always notice when someone's work and war stories are so good, the presentation practically writes itself. Kevin is among the most naturally gifted VFX artists I've known, but he's backed it up with a lot of knowledge and obviously a ton of hard work. I'm going to close with a quote here, one of a bunch of good ones from this conversation. This computer graphics thing, it always felt to me like a great hobby. I'm still laughing about that one. I hope you found his story inspiring, even while obviously a little intimidating to pretty much anyone who didn't happen to start their career working directly with a legendary filmmaker right out of high school. For me, Kevin's story is really about how talent isn't as significant as hard work and loving what you do.